Good morning and welcome everyone to Tuesdays with, a new series being offered here by the Friends of the Georgetown Library. And we didn't know what to expect today, and we are overwhelmed. This is absolutely thrilling. So we are having a Tuesday with Paige Sawyer. And so that's the first of our 14 weeks, I guess, or whatever, as we have this opportunity. Many of you I know are familiar with Paige, family and friends, and we're just really thrilled to have him as our first speaker in this series. Paige is seventh generation South Carolinian. I'm proud to say I'm a first generation South Carolinian. Paige has lived in Georgetown 45 years. I've lived here 3 years, so I have 42 to go yet. That's going to be a while. As you look at his credentials, and many of you are familiar with him, I put toward the top veteran and very active in veteran affairs. A photographer by profession, as many of you are familiar, and we'll be able to enjoy some of that today. He's an instructor with Coastal Carolina University, a very, very excellent tour guide for some of you who had the opportunity to have some of his tours. And I use the next phrase very positively and constructively because I think it speaks very highly of who he is and what he's done, and that is he's a community activist. He has been very active in supporting, encouraging Georgetown, and a town we've grown, my wife and I have grown to love, and it's just because of how wonderful it is and what Paige has done in terms of his community activism. Paige gave me a whole list of options as to what he could speak on, but there was one that got my attention right away, and that is, by George, I didn't know that. And so Paige is going to come today and talk about little-known tidbits of Georgetown's history. And so join me in welcoming Paige Sawyer.
Good morning, y'all. Boy, it's great to see such a large crowd. Who would have thunk we would have many people here? I know Bob is pleased. The Friends of the Georgetown Library are pleased that hopefully this will be an ongoing series, and the rest of you will come back for the continuation of the other speakers. I do apologize. There were 3 women who were going to be here today, but unfortunately they were in an accident and died. They went to heaven. They went to heaven, met St. Peter at the pearly gates, and he said, "Welcome, ladies. We're glad to have y'all. But before you can enter, I must warn you about the ducks." They said, "Ducks? What kind of ducks?" And he opened one of the gates, and they looked inside, and sure enough, there were ducks all over the place, all over the streets, all over the buildings. And he said, "Do not step on a duck. Welcome to heaven, do anything you like, enjoy what we have to offer, but do not step on a duck." Sure enough, as soon as they walked past the pearly gates, one lady stepped on a duck. St. Peter showed up with the ugliest man, I mean ugliest man they had ever seen. He handcuffed her to that man and says, "This is how you're going to spend," how you going to do? He said, "This is how you're going to spend your time in heaven. You other 2 women, y'all be careful and do not step on any ducks." So they made their way through heaven, and one lady, she went 4 or 5 weeks without stepping on a duck, but unfortunately, bad luck came. She stepped on a duck. Out of nowhere, St. Peter comes again with the ugliest man. I mean, he's uglier than the first one. Handcuffs them together and says, "Ma'am, you're spending eternity with this man." The other lady, you know, she's going to be real careful now. She's not going to step on a duck. So she goes 3 or 4 years, no problems whatsoever. All of a sudden, St. Peter comes out of nowhere with this good-looking man. I mean, she has never seen a man who looks this good. He comes up to her and handcuffs her to him. She warms up to him and says, "Man, I don't know what I did, but you're the best looking thing I've ever seen." He said, "Lady, I don't know what you did, but all I did was step on a duck." You know, Bob a while ago mentioned Ollie, and they have wonderful classes, excursions, places to go, things to do. If you're not involved with Ollie, you need to get involved because they offer classes twice a year, fall semester and spring semester. And I've been teaching photography at Ollie for a number of years. And every year in their catalog, or twice a year in their catalog, they have places where they're going. Excursions, trips, day trips, overnight trips. And this is from 2015, 2 years ago, and I was looking at it. There are 2 pages of excursions, and only 2 out of 23 come to Georgetown County. And I said, something's not right here. Georgetown has a lot to offer, just as much as some of these other places. And dadgummit, if they're not coming here, we're going to go to them. So I put together a program by George, I didn't know that, to introduce people to tidbits of history from Georgetown County that you may or may not know. And just about everything we're going to talk about this morning has a story that can be told about it. All right, a lot of people, historic Georgetown. When they come into Georgetown, this is one of the signs they see. In years past, I don't know about now, but years past, when people would go through Georgetown, one of the first things they would ask about, whatever happened to the Sunset Lodge? Or, we go through Georgetown, we can smell it before we get there. That paper mill, I don't know how y'all stand it. Or the flooding. What's going on with the flooding in Georgetown? Or the traffic. We never get off of Highway 17. We go through straight to Myrtle Beach, or we're going south to Charleston. We've never gotten off of Highway 17 to go into Georgetown. Or the fire that you had 4 years ago. What's being built on that property? So those are some of the questions that you hear. All of y'all, who are from Georgetown or from this area, I'm sure you're asked these same questions or get these remarks. Well, years ago, the Georgetown County had a brochure, and I think what it says right up here, interesting place to visit, delightful place to live. I think that applied then just as well as it applies now. When Georgetown, the city of Georgetown, when it was laid out in 1729, this is the historic district. That's the same historic district today. Some of the streets are named King Street, Queen Street, Prince Street, Duke Street, because South Carolina was a colony at that time. Georgetown was the 3rd oldest city, and our allegiance was to the crown. Now, way before 1729, we had a visitor from Spain. He came in 1526, sailed from the Dominican Republic, where old Maria, is making a visit right now. He came up the Atlantic to the North Carolina coast, came down to the South Carolina coast, and we can't prove it, but we think he went into present-day Hobcall Barony. If we could find, and they've had several archaeological digs over at Hobcall trying to verify his existence, his colony that he established here. If we could find proof, if we could prove that he came, Vasquez de Ayllon is his name. If we can find proof that he came in 1526, it would make Georgetown the oldest city on in the U.S. Also in 1971, up on the Black River, about 10 miles up, a diver from the University of South Carolina was diving. Black River is named Black because the water is so dark from the tannic acid. He found a vessel underneath the water loaded with bricks. He knew it was an old vessel, but he didn't really know how old it was because he couldn't see it. They unloaded the bricks, and in 1976 brought up that vessel. They took it to Columbia, Fort Jackson, South Carolina, and put it in a huge vat of water where they preserved the wood that was on it. In 1992, they brought it back to Georgetown since it was found here in Georgetown County. And on the 3rd floor of the Rice Museum Annex, they lifted off the roof of that building and gently placed that vessel on the 3rd floor. Now, while they were doing the research on that vessel, they discovered it was built in 1730, loaded with bricks, sank in 1740, 10 years later, and it's not only the oldest maritime vessel found in Georgetown County, not only the oldest vessel found in South Carolina, not only the oldest vessel found in America, but the oldest maritime colonial era vessel found on the continent of North America. All right up there, a few blocks from us. Sunset Lodge. Whatever happened to the Sunset Lodge? We can't go into a lot of detail. Sunset Lodge operated here in Georgetown for 30 years, a little over 30 years. It opened in 1936. and closed in 1969. Now, 1936 was a very important year for Georgetown. International Paper Company, they were starting their mill. The Highway 17 was being completed with the drawbridge. It was linking Maine to Florida. Sunset Lodge located here. And there were some other things going on at that time also. But the Sunset Lodge was a very frequently visited place. Fort Sumter became a national park in 1948. And a few years after that, it was the #1 tourist attraction. Sunset Lodge remains second. That's what the Sunset Lodge looked like. It was out on Highway 17 south, 7.3 miles from here. On your right, blue marlin. The largest blue marlin ever caught was caught in what they call the Georgetown Hole, which is about 50 miles off the shore of Georgetown. It was caught by a crew from the Rascal, who docks their boat here in Georgetown. And I told you it was called the Georgetown Hole. Anybody play golf? Must not be anybody because y'all are all here. If you've ever played at True Blue Plantation, True Blue over at Pawleys Island, anybody know why it's named True Blue? Indigo was grown here in Georgetown. It was a wild plant. It still grows out in the woods now. Indigo was a very cash crop for the early settlers here in Georgetown. They grew indigo. They traded it to England. England wanted their indigo because of the blue robes of Parliament members and people of the crown who had to have blue. The Wynyard Indigo Society was formed from the planters of the indigo crop. Dues were paid in indigo. Thomas Lynch Sr. was the first president of the Indigo Society. The Revolutionary War came along, ended the trade of indigo with England. Our forefathers went to Philadelphia to sign the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Lynch Jr. and his father, Thomas Lynch Sr., they were on the way when Thomas Lynch Sr. had a stroke. He couldn't sign. Thomas Lynch Jr. signed it, and there's a space right there for Thomas Lynch Sr. Now, if you want to know more about the Lynches, Hops and Wheat Plantation, just on the North Santee River, about 10 or 12 miles from here, is open probably 6 or 7 days a week. Good place to visit, and one of the few remaining structures that was owned by a signer of the Declaration of Independence. The Wynyard Indigo Society is still in existence. They built this hall in 1857. It's used for receptions, banquets, social events. The state of South Carolina has 8 lighthouses up and down the coast. And I forgot to tell you all this. I'm just throwing things out at random. This is not in chronological order or anything. It's just bits and pieces coming to you. South Carolina has 8 different lighthouses, only 2 aid in navigation, the Georgetown Lighthouse and the New Charleston Lighthouse, here and here. And guess which one is the oldest one in continuous operation? The Georgetown Lighthouse. The present-day lighthouse was built in 1810. It was finished in 1811. The first one was built in 1801. It was blown down by a hurricane in 1806. They said we're going to build a more permanent structure this time, make it hurricane-proof, so they dug a hole 50 feet deep, filled it full of concrete, and started building the present-day lighthouse, not out of cypress wood, but out of brick and mortar. It has 127 solid granite steps going around the center, which gives it even greater stability. In 1986, it became fully automated. They took the lens out of the lighthouse that was used for over 100 years, and it's on display at the Maritime Museum. Beautiful piece of craftsmanship. It was made in France, and it's called a Fresnel lens. But the way it's made, it intensifies the light that comes from it. The present-day lighthouse has a rotating beacon. It flashes twice every 15 seconds and can be seen 15 miles out into the ocean. All right, some of you recognize this building. This is Duncan Memorial United Methodist Church. The sanctuary was built in 1903. This is what it looks like today. Anybody recognize that gentleman?
Francis Asbury.
Francis Asbury. Even though the church wasn't built until the early 1900s, Francis Asbury came through Georgetown in 1785 and established the first Methodist congregation in South Carolina. Georgetown had a Methodist congregation before America had a president. Several movies have been filmed in Georgetown County. The Notebook, part of that was filmed at Black River House on the Black River. The Patriot, part of that was filmed at Mansfield Plantation, also on the Black River. Paradise, parts of that movie were filmed right downtown on Front Street. The Shag, the movie, part of that was filmed at Whitehall Plantation, just north of, or just south of Belle Isle Plantation. And in 1924, a silent movie was filmed here in Georgetown. Pied Piper Malone and several Georgetonians, they're no longer with us, they've since died, were used as extras. They were all kids in that movie. The interesting thing about this movie, they tried to find copies of it for a long time. It didn't exist. They found one copy in Russia. They purchased, the Georgetown Historical Society purchased the copy. They made digital CDs from it, and it's available now, and you can see it. And if you know, or if you knew some of the children, you can recognize them. All right, now this is an overview of Wynyard Bay. Now let's start up here. This is Pawleys Island right here. Right here is Pawleys Plantation. Down here is Debadoo. You come on down to North Inlet. This is North Island. This is the North Jetty going out into the ocean. This is the South Jetty going out into the ocean. And this is the entrance to Wynyard Bay. Let's keep going south. You come south, South Island. Let's go over here, get on Highway 17 going north. This is Charleston County. You cross the South Santee River into Georgetown County, Santee Delta, the North Santee River, Hopsweed Plantations right here. You keep on 17 north. The Georgetown Airport is here. Come on into Maryville. Come into International Paper Company is over here. Cross over the Sandpit River. City of Georgetown is all along in here. This is Goat Island. 17, continuing north, you cross over the Black and PD rivers, the Waccamaw River, and on back up north. Now, Wynyard Bay, that's what we're going to talk about. It's the third largest estuary on the East Coast. Anybody know what an estuary is? Speaking of water. An estuary is a body of water that collects water from two or more other sources, specifically an ocean. Now, Wynyard Bay collects water from the Atlantic Ocean and from these four rivers. All that water flows into Wynyard Bay, and it's an estuary which also gives life to shrimp, oysters, and crabs. If we didn't have an estuary and marshes, I don't think we'd be alive today, because that's what generates, you know, human, or not human, but life. The third, Wynyard Bay is the third largest estuary on the East Coast. The first largest is Chesapeake Bay. Second largest is the Pamplico Sound in North Carolina, and the third largest is Wynyard Bay. Now, if any of you have been on Wynyard Bay, you'll know it's no small thing. It's 525,000 acres, and we're the third largest. Now, a gentleman who knew a lot about Georgetown County, Berkeley County, Dorchester County, parts of Charleston County, Marion County, Florence County, was Francis Marion. He helped South Carolina win the Revolutionary War. Georgetown was captured by the British in 1780 and 1781. Guess who rescued Georgetown? Francis Marion. The oldest fish house in South Carolina is right at the end of Meeting Street. I'm sorry, end of St. James Street. The Couthou Fish House. The Couthou family, they were French Huguenots. They came to America. They heard the fishing was good in Charleston. Fishing was good in Georgetown. They moved to Charleston and established the Couthou Fish House. Now, the Couthou Fish House, back during the 50s and 60s, they were well known for their caviar. Yep, wrong button. Now, the caviar comes from the Atlantic sturgeon, which is a very populous fish out in Wynyard Bay. Any of you who have been out in Wynyard Bay, you've probably seen sturgeons. They just jump up and go right back in the water. Now, unfortunately, it was overfished. It's on the endangered list, but a large female sturgeon may have up to 300 pounds of fish eggs or roe in her stomach. They were taken back to that fish house that we just saw, processed into caviar, And during the 50s and 60s, caviar from this fish house was wanted all over the eastern coast of the U.S. When President Kennedy, when he was sworn in at his inaugural get-together in January 1961, caviar from Cthulhu's Fish House was served. Were any of y'all there? I didn't know if you got a taste of it or not. All right. We've had 4 presidents come through Georgetown. I'm sure you all recognize this one. Old George. He came through, George Washington came through in 1792 during his southern tour. James Monroe came through in 1819. Grover Cleveland came through Georgetown in 1894 to hunt ducks. He was a friend of Alexander Porter, who owned South Island, and Mr. Porter had invited him to South Island to hunt ducks. And Franklin D. Roosevelt visited Georgetown on a secret mission in 1944. Nobody knew he was here except for everybody in Georgetown. They had reporters that went to the Prince George Hotel on Front Street. And you know, small town, 5,000 people, why are y'all here? The president's coming. They would go to the telegraph office across the street, send telegrams. You know, we don't think he's coming. He's not coming. He was coming. The Coast Guard. Well, he came on behalf of Wynyard Baruch. That's where he was going. The Coast Guard and the Navy had cruisers out here in Wynyard Bay and up and down the Atlantic coast. They had balloons up in the air. Nobody knew he was coming until he came on Easter Sunday, 1944, got off the train in Grave Station and got into the presidential motorcade and came on into Georgetown. There were people, Georgetown at that time, either Front Street or High Market. Front Street was Highway 17, so they came, or either High Market, I can't remember, but they came in, all the kids, all the people knew Franklin Roosevelt was coming. They were on the side of the street waving at him when he came by. The reporters, before Franklin Roosevelt got here, the 3 reporters who were here said, I don't know why he's coming to Georgetown. There's nothing here. There's a paper industry and a fishing industry here. They close up the sidewalks at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. If you want to have any activity, you go to Charleston. But I can't understand why there are 9 liquor stores here to serve 5,000 people. Anyway, Franklin Roosevelt came under the direction of his doctors. The doctors told him, you need to take a break. This was in April, May 1944, right before they planned, or not before they planned, but they were planning D-Day at that time, which was going to take place in June of 1944. But he was in bad shape. You can see his ashtray here. He smoked consistently. You know, he had contracted polio. His health wasn't good. He was originally going to Florida, but Wynyard Baruch was a financial advisor to Mr. Roosevelt, and he said, come to my place on Hobcall Bay. Hobcall Barony. You can stay there. My staff will take care of you. He said, all right, 2 weeks. 2 weeks. He had such a good time and such R&R that he stayed 4 weeks. He didn't want to go back. Now, Grover Cleveland sort of put Georgetown County on the map when he came in 1894 and started shooting ducks. You can see he was a rather large man, weighed in about 300 pounds. Either he fell out of the boat or he went to retrieve a duck and got out of the boat, and the guides that were with him, they could not get him back in. They had to get about 3 of them. And here's the president of the U.S., and they would like to call him a name or something for getting out of the boat, but they couldn't. They had to maintain their composure. But they got him back in the boat, and back in 1894, as you well know, we didn't have CNN or 24/7 or tweets or anything. So it wasn't until a week or so later before the U.S. found out that Grover Cleveland was in Georgetown County hunting ducks and fell out of the boat. So when that news got out, duck hunters from all up north started wondering, why Georgetown County? Well, Georgetown County, prior to his coming, had over 150 rice plantations. After the war between the states, the rice plantations went in disrepair, and ducks in their migration started coming to Georgetown County because of all the rice fields. Well, once northern hunters found out, they started checking into some of the remaining plantations to see if they could be bought for hunting preserves. Well, Wynyard Baruch He was a native South Carolinian. He was born in 1870 in Camden, but unfortunately he moved to New York when he was he didn't move, his parents moved, and he had to go with them. He went up to New York, and he was invited back to Georgetown County in 1903 to hunt ducks. While he was here, that property, Hopcaw Barony, at one time had 9 rice plantations on it. While he was here hunting ducks, he found out that 6 of those rice plantations were for sale for 50 cents an acre. He bought all 6, and 2 years later bought the remaining 3. Now he had all this land that had 9 former rice plantations on it. He did away with their individual names and gave it the name Hopcaw Barony. Hopcaw, an Indian word meaning between the waters. This property is 17,000 acres. It sits on the Waccamaw River on the front and the Atlantic Ocean on the back. It's larger than Manhattan in the city of New York. Now, while Mr. Baruch was here, he entertained a wide circle of friends. Sir Winston Churchill came in 1932. Mrs. Woodrow Wilson, wife of the former president. Mr. Baruch, he was a financial advisor to 7 different presidents, and even after Harry S. Truman, Presidents Johnson and Kennedy would call him every now and then with a global financial question. He could answer it just like that. Rockwell Kent, the guy who drew the illustrations for the novel Moby Dick. Admiral Leahy, Irving Berlin, songwriter, composer. The Luce family, you may not know their names. They owned a plantation down in Monk's Corner, but they're the people who started Time Life Publishing. General George Marshall, Josephus Daniels, Secretary of the Navy. Jack Pershing, he was a general during World War I. They were all friends of Mr. Baruch. Now, Mr. and Mrs. Baruch had 3 children, Belle, Tina, and Junior. Belle was the adventurous one of the 3. She loved to hunt and fish just like her father. She couldn't wait to get back to Georgetown so she could hunt and fish. She joined the Signal Corps during World War I. When she turned 21, she got a real nice gift for turning 21, $1 million. That's how wealthy this family was. She took her $1 million, went to France, bought some horses, started show jumping, winning competition after competition after competition. Even Hitler and Mussolini, they had teams in the competition. She was out jumping them. They approached her about buying her horses. She said, "Ain't no way, Jose. You're not getting any of my horses. In fact, I'm going back to America." She came back to America. She brought her horses with her. She brought her trainers. She built a place over at Hopcaw called Belfield, which is down from the big house. She quit hunting at that time, started becoming a more lover of animals and wildlife, started taming deer and turkeys and raccoons. She finally talked her father into buying the property. He sold it to her. She bought the property. She knew she didn't want to sell out to developers like some of the other plantations were doing. She set up a trust with the board of directors and put that property into a trust. She died in 1964, but on that property are 2 research facilities, one operated by Clemson, one operated by the University of South Carolina. And every year, students from over 25 different colleges and universities gather on Hopcaw Barony and study marine biology, coastal ecology, and forest management. Anybody recognize this gentleman? Who said boss hog? All right, Lafayette. Can you imagine being 19 years old, living in France? A country across the Atlantic is fighting a war with the British, and he says, "I'm going to help them fight the British." He didn't tell his 16-year-old pregnant wife where he was going. He and his crew, they got on several boats, came across. They were going into Charleston. The port of Charleston was blockaded by the British. He said, "We're not going in there." So they came up the coast to Georgetown, saw North Island. They saw 2 slaves out digging oysters on North Island. He spoke French. The slaves spoke Gullah and English. They couldn't understand each other, but they said, "Follow me." They went to a house on North Island. Benjamin U.G., they talked, they wined and dined. Mr. U.G. being a former Frenchman or understood some French, and he could understand Lafayette. They wined and dined. The next day they went across Wynyard Bay to South Island. They walked, rode on horses to Charleston. Took them about 3 days to get there. They were all cut up from briars and making their way through the woods. The boat finally got back in Charleston about 4 days later. They wined and dined Mr. Lafayette in Charleston. He also had a friend with him, Baron DeKalb. They wined and dined together. They then went to Philadelphia, where General George Washington made Mr. Lafayette a brevet general. And to this day, he's still the youngest brevet general at age 19 that our country has ever had. Baron DeKalb, he fought in the Battle of Camden. He was killed there in 1780. Lafayette, he went on to bigger and brighter things, and there are plaques and gardens all over Georgetown named in honor of Marquis de Lafayette for his efforts in helping us win our independence from Great Britain. Rice. Anybody like rice? Rice-a-roni? All right, rice. Georgetown County, after Indigo, had a very, 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 very large crop of rice. Who worked in the rice fields? Slaves. Now the planters in Georgetown County wanted slaves from the west coast of Africa because they were growing rice there. So they wanted those slaves, those particular slaves. The slaves brought a lot of the rice growing techniques with them to Georgetown, and had it not been for slaves, Georgetown County wouldn't have produced the amount of rice they did. At one time, Georgetown County was producing 1/2 of all the rice consumed in America. Now, it was a hard life for a slave on a rice plantation. Now here they've cleared the land, but just think this land still had trees on it. Let's cut down those trees. We've got some axes and some saws, cut them down. We've got to remove these stumps. We've got some mules over here. Let's get those stumps out of the way. Now we've got to get the roots out of the ground. It may take 4 or 5 years before they could get that piece of land ready to plant rice. So the slaves, without their labor, Georgetown County wouldn't have been as rich as it was. Now, Georgetown County, I mentioned earlier, had over 150 rice plantations. This is the South Santee River going towards Charleston. This is the North Santee River. You recognize some of the names. This is the what's called the government cut, or the waterway here. This is Wynyard Bay, Esterville, Dover, Battery White, Belle Isle, Whitehall, Maryville, Oakley. This is on the Black River, the PD, and the Waccamaw. Some of those names are still recognizable today. So rice was a very important cash crop for Georgetown. The largest slave owner in America, had several rice plantations where today, present day, Brook Green Gardens is. When he died in 1865, he had over 1,100 slaves. He owned several plantations, not just one plantation. Now, Joseph Haynes Rainey, a black gentleman from here in the city of Georgetown, he was the first elected black to Congress after the war between the states. His house still stands. It's on Prince Street. It has a historical marker right next to it. And there's also a park named for Mr. Rainey, Rainey Park on Front Street. Now, Mr. Rainey, we were talking about the largest slave owner in Georgetown County. Mr. Rainey's family owned 2 slaves at one time. Between 1840 and 1860, there were about 12 to 15 free blacks who were free, who owned slaves in Georgetown County. One on the North Santee River owned 30 slaves. So, you know, that was what was going on at that time. It wasn't just whites owning owning blacks, but blacks owning blacks also. Anybody recognize this man? Joel Poinsett. And we have a flower named after Mr. Poinsett. He named it himself, the poinsettia. He was ambassador to Mexico, but while he was living in America, he lived at Black River Plantation on the Black River here in Georgetown County. You've all seen this flag? Anybody know who designed it? Christopher Gadsden. He lived at Benavent Plantation, also here in Georgetown County. The Harvest Moon. The Harvest Moon was a ship originally built as a ferry boat In 1862, it was going to ferry passengers up and down the coast of Maine and once a week going to Boston. During that time, the war between the states, neither the U.S. Navy nor the Confederate Navy had any new ships because most of the battles they were fighting with each other were fought on land. Well, the U.S. Navy, they needed a new ship. They needed a flagship. Flagship's the most important ship for a Navy. So they bought the Harvest Moon in 1863 for $99,000. They took it to a naval shipyard. They put 6 cannons on it and outfitted it with military naval hardware. The admiral on board was John Dahlgren, and the Harvest Moon was assigned to the South Atlantic Blockading Squadron in Charleston. Now, why would they have a blockading squadron in Charleston? They were blocking Confederate ships from bringing in supplies and or taking out supplies. Now, the squadron, they were also blocking the port of Savannah, about 75 miles south of Charleston, and the port of Georgetown, about 75 miles north of Charleston. So they were keeping out Confederate ships from coming in and keeping them from going out. Now, Battery White, Confederate fortification on Wynyard Bay, was abandoned in 1864. So that left Georgetown defenseless. So there were 2 men here in Georgetown who said, you know, if the Yankees, the Union Army, if they come into Georgetown, we don't have any way to defend ourselves. Battery White, at least they could fire cannonballs out into Wynyard Bay and keep them at bay. So 2 men in Georgetown, when they found out Battery White was abandoned, they said, well, we're going to do something. So this building right here presently houses the Rice Museum Annex. It's on the 3rd floor of this building where the Black River vessel is. It was 2 stories at this time in 1864. They were on the 2nd floor building keg mines. These mines made out of a 50-gallon barrel drum with cones on each end, had a fuse, and they filled it full of gunpowder. They built 17 of those mines and placed them randomly out in Wynyard Bay in hopes that any Union ships coming in would hit one. Well, guess what happened? The Harvest Moon came up in February 1865, accepted the surrender papers from the city officials, hoisted an American flag above the town clock. The next morning at 7:30, they pulled anchor to head south to Charleston. 5 minutes later, they were sitting on the bottom of Wynyard Bay, the result of a Confederate mine. The only U.S. Navy flagship ever sunk by a Confederate mine. You can still see the top of the smokestack. It's out in Wynyard Bay, just east of Battery White or Belle Isle. In 1964, when our country, we were celebrating the centennial of that war, they sent divers to Georgetown to see if they could salvage that ship. Y'all know what pluff mud is? That gooey stuff, yeah, it holds the earth together. All right. They sent divers to Georgetown to Wynyard Bay to dive on that ship, and they had these 10-foot steel rods they were poking through the pluff mud to see how thick the pluff mud was on top of the boat. They determined it was going to cost too much money to raise it. So at that time, the U.S. Navy relinquished ownership of it and gave it to the state of South Carolina. There have been several historical groups who have dove on the ship trying to raise it, but they determined it was just going to be too costly, and it still sits there today. Now, this is a little added extra. The captain on that ship was Captain John Crosby. Now, Crosby, a year earlier, he was in Charleston Harbor as part of that blockade on the USS Housatonic. Now, if you know anything about the history of the Housatonic, it was sank in 1864 by the CSS Hunley, the only U.S. Navy ship ever sunk by a Confederate submarine. Well, he was on the Harvest Moon a year later, the only U.S. Navy ship ever sunk by a Confederate mine. When he retired, he tried to draw his pension for several years, and the Navy said, no, man, your record's too bad. You have new ships sank from underneath you. And finally, they relented and gave him $25 a month. He died a few months after that, but he did get some retirement. In the meantime, we've given him the nickname Captain Crunch. All right, Tom Yawkey. Mr. Yawkey. He was in the right place at the right time. His uncle, Bill Yawkey, was a millionaire from Michigan. He owned the Detroit Tigers. He had made his money in the mining and timber industry, and he was also the guardian for his nephew, Tom. Tom had lost both his parents. Bill Yawkey was raising him. Every summer they spent in Detroit watching the Tigers play. Mr. Yawkey owned the Detroit Tigers. every winter. They were down here in Georgetown. Mr. Yawkey had bought South Island, Cat Island, and North Island from Edward Porter Alexander, the Confederate general who had invited Grover Cleveland. Mr. Yawkey unfortunately died in 1916 from the Spanish flu. In his will, he indicated that his nephew Tom was going to inherit all of his millions of dollars and all of this land. But he couldn't touch it until he turned 30 years old. Tom was 16 at that time. When he turned 30, the first thing he wanted to do was to buy a ball team. The Tigers were not for sale, but the Boston Red Sox were. Every summer, just like when he was a child, he and Mrs. Yawkey were at Fenway Park watching the Red Sox play baseball. Every winter, they were down in Georgetown hunting and fishing. You never saw Mr. Yawkey, regardless of what he wore. He could be in shorts and a t-shirt. He had on a Boston Red Sox cap. Coat and tie, he had on a Boston Red Sox cap. Remember the picture of Sir Winston Churchill you saw a while ago with Wynyard Baruch? That was in 1932. The Baruchs, they were having a get-together for Sir Winston Churchill. You know, how many people are invited to a get-together for Sir Winston Churchill? Tom Yawkey, being the laid-back person he was, he received the engraved invitation, and on the bottom it said, black tie only. He chunked that thing in the trash can and said, I'm not putting on a black tie to go see Sir Winston Churchill. So he stayed on South Island and hunted and fishing, and hunted and fished, and didn't worry about social events. Now this shows you what all land he owned. This is North Island. This is Cat Island. It's separated by Mosquito Creek into South Island. Now all this property, it's 14,500 acres over here on North Island and 14,500 acres here. Almost 20,000 acres of land. Mr. Yawkey was very generous with that property. He died in 1976 and he willed it to the state of South Carolina. One of the largest land gifts ever given to the state of South Carolina. And there will never be any condominiums, hotels, golf courses, or anything built on that property. And if you want to visit South Island, North Island, or the Lighthouse, those tours are available. Mr. Yawkey also invested in the Sunset Lodge in 1936 when it opened. Now, one ship that came into Georgetown, we don't really know how, but this ship was built in 1931 in Germany. It was called the USS Are, almost 400 feet long, 396 feet long, and it could go months sailing. In fact, it was the largest privately owned yacht at that time. It was owned by Marjorie Meriwether Post, whose family owned Post Cereal, and her husband E.F. Hutton. Everybody says he's E.F. Hutton. That saying, that commercial. And this is their daughter, Dina Merrill. She died back in April and May of this year. I've forgotten how old she was. But anyway, they were getting a divorce in the 1930s. And we don't know why, but the USS Are came to Georgetown. It was docked right up there on Front Street. You can see that's the Parker Stewart house back here, and this is the Kaminsky house. So this is in the 900 block of Front Street. While it was docked here, while we were going through divorce proceedings, children, school groups, they would go and tour the boat. That was a big thing. Get out of school, go see the largest privately owned yacht. During World War II, she loaned the boat. Oh, they got the divorce, and she was awarded the boat. She changed the name at that time to the Sea Cloud. During World War II, she loaned the boat to the U.S. Navy or the Coast Guard. They made it a military vessel. After the war ended, they converted it back to the sailing ship it is today. It's still around today. If any of you want to take a cruise, just Google Sea Cloud, and you can take a Mediterranean or a Caribbean cruise in a stateroom like this. Marble fireplace. I have that number if anybody wants. Just kidding.
Just wait until after November 30th for the cruise.
There you go, yeah, after the storm. Speaking of ships, back in the early 1900s up into the Depression, we had large ships coming into Georgetown. Why were they coming into Georgetown? They were coming into Georgetown to load lumber. The Atlantic Coast Lumber Mill was here in Georgetown, one of the largest lumber mills on the East Coast. Georgetown County had all this timber. cypress, Tupelo gum, oak. And people up north, it was a buying frenzy going on up there, so they were looking for good lumber. This is where the present-day steel mill is located. But you can see all the lumber as it was being cut through the lumber mills, floated out into the river, and then put on boats that were taking it up north. You all know the story about Anna Huntington, Anna and Archer Huntington. They bought several of the plantations over on the Waccamaw Neck, established Brook Green Gardens. Now, I know we live in an area that's full of history, we live in an area that's full of natural beauty, we live in an area that's full of wonderful people. So by George, you know a little bit more now. We should all be cheerleaders for the place we live, and we thank you very much for being here this morning.